They called it the Night of Honor, a sacred union blessed by the Sultan himself, a celebration of beauty, obedience, and destiny. But behind the golden doors of the Topkapi Palace, the truth was much darker. For centuries, Ottoman princesses lived surrounded by silk, diamonds, and poetry. Yet, when the sun set on their wedding night, every one of them trembled in silence. They were not brides. They were offerings. Their bodies were gifts of loyalty, currency in the politics of empire. The empire wanted them pure, obedient, and silent. And on that one night, the honor of marriage, purity was tested not by love, but by ritual. A ritual so cruel, so haunting, that it was erased from official chronicles for 600 years. But the palace remembers. The walls remember. The echoes of that night still whisper through history. This is not a fairy tale. This is not the story of palaces and roses. This is the story of fear, the kind that wears a crown. To understand why Ottoman princesses feared their wedding night, you must first understand the cage they were born into. The Ottoman palace, Topkapi Sarai, stood like a living labyrinth of silence and power. Its walls shimmered with gold, its corridors filled with the scent of rosewater and incense. But beneath that perfume was the heavy odor of control. Every breath inside the harem was observed, every word measured, every smile could mean life or death. The harem was not merely a house of women, it was a system, a machine of empire. It was where alliances were built not through treaties, but through wounds. The sultan's daughters, nieces, and sisters were raised not to dream, but to serve the dynasty's survival. They were taught how to walk, how to lower their gaze, how to speak only when spoken to. They were schooled in embroidery, calligraphy, music, and silence. Always silence. To speak too much was dangerous. To be too beautiful, even more so. Outside the harem walls, the empire stretched from North Africa to Persia. But inside, time stood still. The air itself felt heavy, as if the walls absorbed centuries of secrets. And yet, within that gilded silence, the girls dreamed. They dreamed of love. They whispered about freedom. But every dream ended with the same sound, the echo of a closing door. That door, the door to the bridal chamber. The preparation for a royal wedding was a spectacle of perfection. Weeks before the ceremony, the chosen princess would be bathed in milk, perfumed with amber, and dressed in layers of silk so heavy she could barely breathe. Every stitch of her gown was inspected by court eunuchs. Every strand of hair counted, for even a single imperfection could be seen as a sign of impurity. The older women of the harem, the Khalfa, would whisper warnings to her. Do not cry. Do not resist. Do not look into his eyes. Because that night was not for her. It was for the empire. The man she would marry was rarely a stranger, but never a lover. He could be a governor, a military commander, sometimes even a political hostage. The sultan would decide. Always the sultan. For to marry a princess was both an honor and a death sentence. A symbol of ultimate trust, and absolute surveillance. Once married, the man's power was tied to her womb. If she bore children, his rank rose. If she failed, his life might quietly end. Imagine being 15, crowned in gold, surrounded by 1,000 candles, and knowing that the man waiting behind the curtain could determine your fate with a single touch. That was the life of an Ottoman princess, and the night she feared most was about to begin. They called it the Night of Purity, a ritual meant to prove the princess's innocence, a concept both sacred and cruel. In the center of the bridal chamber stood a low bed draped in red silk, symbolizing the blood of sacrifice. On the table nearby, gold bowls filled with rosewater, white cloth, and a small silver dagger. The dagger, they said, was symbolic, but history whispers otherwise. For centuries, Ottoman chroniclers wrote only of joy, of divine union. But hidden letters, preserved in forgotten archives, tell a different story. A story of fear, of trembling hands, of women who prayed the night would pass quickly. The walls of Topkapi were designed to echo softly. Even the faintest cry could travel through the marble halls. That night, guards would walk slowly along the corridors, pretending not to hear. In the harem, silence was law, and on the wedding night, it was sacred. Because a scream from a princess was a scandal for an empire. They were told this was tradition, that the ancestors did the same, that purity was the measure of a woman's worth. But the princesses knew better. They understood the unspoken rule, that obedience was more valuable than bloodline, and silence was the true sign of nobility. They learned to smile through pain, to bow when frightened, to survive by becoming invisible. And so, the ritual continued, year after year, generation after generation. The daughters of empires, brides of ghosts. The first night was a test, not of love, but of loyalty. What happened behind those closed doors was never written down, but history remembers through shadows, and sometimes, the silence says enough. They said a princess's fate was written before she was born. In the Ottoman palace, daughters of the royal bloodline were not merely children, they were political instruments, living tokens of loyalty and power. From the moment they took their first breath, a woman's worth was measured not by her mind or her spirit, but by the purity of her body. That body would one day carry the blood of alliances, or spill it. The process began long before the wedding night, long before any man was chosen. It began with the selection. Inside the palace, there was a room few ever entered. It was called the Chamber of Choosing. Lit only by oil lamps and perfumed with musk, the room was lined with silk cushions and guarded by the silent eunuchs, men stripped of their manhood so they could guard the women of others. Here, the elder women of the harem, the Khalfa and the Hazinadar, met with royal advisors, scribes, and sometimes the Sultan himself. They would review scrolls listing the names of high-ranking officials, pashas, governors, military commanders. Each man was evaluated not by love, but by loyalty. Had he served the empire faithfully? Was his family of noble origin? Had he ever shown disobedience? A perfect match was one who could be trusted with silence. Because to marry a princess was not just to gain honor, it was to become part of the empire's most delicate secret. The princesses themselves were told little. They were summoned quietly by the chief attendant. A simple order. The Sultan requests your presence. There were no questions allowed, only obedience. The girl would be led through the candlelit corridors, her footsteps echoing over marble floors polished by centuries of fear. She would enter the Chamber of Choosing, where elders examined her like a jewel. They looked not into her soul, but at her skin, her hair, her teeth, her wrists, her posture. Everything was observed, recorded, and judged. She was expected to bow, to remain still as they measured the distance between her shoulders, the symmetry of her face, the softness of her voice. This was not beauty, it was biology. For the empire believed perfection reflected divine order, and any imperfection was a whisper of rebellion against God. After the physical inspection came something worse, the test of purity. It was said to be sacred, a necessary ritual to prove the innocence of a royal bride, but to the young women, it was humiliation cloaked in holiness. The matron of the harem, usually an aging concubine once favored by the Sultan, would preside over the test. It was performed not in a grand hall, but in a small, candlelit room, where only women were permitted to enter. The princess stood in silence as her attendants disrobed her, washing her skin with rosewater that felt cold as fear. They brushed her hair, braided it, and wrapped her body in thin silk, so light it barely concealed her form. Then the matron would mark her forehead with saffron, a sign of purity, and whisper a short prayer to the Almighty. And yet, what followed was no prayer. Behind closed curtains, they would inspect her body in silence, a procedure so invasive that many fainted, their shame hidden behind polite smiles and perfumed air. The eunuchs guarded the door, listening only for the signal, 3 soft knocks. When it came, the ritual was complete. A scribe would record her name in the royal register, next to a single word, pure. And with that word, her life no longer belonged to her. In the days that followed, the palace would transform. Gold trays of sweets were carried through the halls. Perfumes burned in every corner. Musicians rehearsed songs of celebration. But for the chosen princess, joy was forbidden. Her days became a blur of endless preparation, fittings for jeweled dresses, lessons in etiquette, and instructions whispered in the dark. She was told what to say, how to bow, when to cry, and when not to. Her wedding was a state affair. Her husband-to-be, a man she had never spoken to, was chosen weeks earlier. His loyalty, not his love, was the reason for the union. When he received the Sultan's decree, he would bow deeply and accept. To refuse was to die. And so, both bride and groom entered the marriage as prisoners of the same golden chain. As the wedding day approached, the princess would be confined to her chamber. No visitors, no sunlight, only the constant hum of attendants reciting prayers, and the occasional sound of silk being folded. Her meals grew lighter each day, a symbolic purification. No meat, no heavy bread, only fruit and milk to cleanse the spirit. In the evenings, she was bathed again in scented water, while old women murmured verses from the Quran. But their tone was not comforting, it was ceremonial, almost cold. Each word carried the weight of duty, as if they were preparing her for sacrifice rather than marriage. On the final night before the ceremony, she would be dressed in a white robe embroidered with gold thread. The robe was heavy, its pattern filled with symbols of loyalty and patience, flowers that never bloomed, birds that never flew. A veil would cover her face, woven so finely that only her eyes could be seen. They said that on this night, a princess must not see her own reflection. Mirrors were covered, so that no woman could confront her fear, or her identity. When dawn broke, the palace came alive. Drums echoed through the courtyards, trumpets sang the anthem of the dynasty. But in the princess's room, the air was still. The attendants stood in rows, their faces expressionless. The chief eunuch entered, holding a small golden tray. On it, a silk handkerchief folded neatly beside a silver ring. The handkerchief was a symbol. Before the night was over, it was expected to bear the mark of proof. The princess's eyes trembled as she accepted it, knowing exactly what it meant. It was a test not just of her body, but of her compliance. Failure was not an option, because in the empire's eyes, a defiant woman was a curse. The procession began. She walked slowly through the corridors, barefoot on cold marble. The sound of distant music mixed with the whisper of silk. In the courtyard, thousands of eyes watched. The Grand Vizier, the royal family, the court poets, all gathered to witness the illusion of joy. They called it a wedding, but it was closer to a coronation of obedience. The Sultan himself stood at the top of the stairs, his face unreadable. He raised his hand, and the ceremony began. The vows were short. There were no, "I love you," no promises of happiness. Only one phrase mattered, the declaration of loyalty. When it was done, the princess was led away by her attendants. She did not look back. Behind her, fireworks lit the night sky over Istanbul, reflected on the dark waters of the Bosphorus. The city celebrated, but inside the palace walls, a new silence was beginning. That night, as the music faded, the princess sat alone in her chamber, her body adorned with gold, her heart heavy with dread. In the corner of the room, a single candle flickered, casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. Every breath felt rehearsed, every thought forbidden. The eunuchs would soon knock on the door, 3 times, to announce the arrival of her husband. The moment she had been raised for, the night every Ottoman princess feared. She whispered a prayer, not for love, but for survival. Then the candle went out. The palace was silent. Not a single note of the music that had echoed through the halls hours earlier remained. The scent of rose oil still lingered in the air, but beneath it, a tension so thick it felt alive. In the women's quarters, servants moved like shadows. They whispered no words, exchanged no glances. Each knew the order of the night by heart. They had performed it countless times, yet every time it began again, the same chill returned. The ritual was called the Night of Obedience. But those who witnessed it privately called it what it truly was, the night of fear. When the appointed hour arrived, the chief eunuch knocked 3 times on the heavy wooden door. The sound was slow, deliberate, ritualistic, a rhythm that marked the passing of innocence into submission. Inside, the princess sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the candle flame before her. She had been told not to speak, not to rise, not to cry. Even her breath seemed rehearsed. The old attendants approached her silently. They adjusted the golden belt tied around her waist, straightened the silk robe that shimmered faintly under the candlelight, and placed a sheer red veil over her head. The color was symbolic, a sign of life, of blood, of the empire's unbroken lineage. But to her, it felt like a shroud. When the door opened, the air in the chamber changed. A gust of cold wind carried the faint echo of the Bosphorus below, and with it, the scent of sea salt and incense. He entered, the man she would call husband. He did not speak. He did not smile. He bowed once before her, as custom required, and waited. The attendants withdrew quietly, leaving the two of them alone. The door shut behind them with a dull, final sound, like a stone sealing a tomb. For a long time, there was nothing. No words, no movement, only the soft crackle of the candle's flame, and the quiet hum of the night outside. He stood by the window, staring out at the dark sea. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. Her fingers trembled, but she hid them beneath the folds of silk. In the Empire's records, this was the moment of union, a sacred bond, a divine ceremony. But the truth was colder. It was a performance, staged for a god that demanded obedience more than love. According to tradition, a witness had to be present, not inside the room, but beyond the curtain, behind a lattice screen carved into the wall. There, in the shadows, an older woman, usually a trusted servant or the matron of the harem, listened. She could not see, but she could hear. Her duty was not compassion, it was verification. The empire required proof that the marriage had been fulfilled. Without it, the union was void, and both lives would hang in the balance. The man turned at last, his expression unreadable. He approached her slowly, as if approaching an altar. He spoke her name only once, softly, almost a whisper, a formality rather than affection. The princess lowered her gaze. She had been taught that a royal woman must not look directly into a man's eyes on this night. It was considered immodest and dangerous. He reached out, took the silk handkerchief from the golden tray beside the bed, and placed it gently in her lap. It was the same cloth given to her that morning, the same one she had carried through the ceremony. Now, it lay between them, symbolizing both trust and terror. In the hallway beyond the door, the eunuchs waited. They stood in silence, hands folded, their eyes fixed on the marble floor. They were forbidden to speak, forbidden even to look at one another. Only the flickering torchlight revealed the tension in their faces. They, too, had seen this night countless times. They, too, knew its weight. For even though they were men without desire, they were not without memory. And memory, in this place, was dangerous. Inside, the candle burned lower. The princess sat perfectly still. Her breathing grew shallow, her mind retreating into that place where fear becomes numbness. There were no words of comfort, no tenderness. Only the sound of ritual, fabric shifting, footsteps crossing the floor, the faint clinking of metal jewelry. When the candle finally extinguished itself, darkness swallowed the room. What happened in that darkness, no record describes. The scribes wrote only that the union was completed, that the princess fulfilled her duty. But the fragments that survive in private letters, hidden diaries, and whispered accounts, tell of something far different. They tell of tears muffled in pillows, of prayers spoken in broken whispers, of the faint sob that sometimes slipped through the curtain, echoing into the corridor beyond. And then, silence. Hours passed. When dawn crept over the Bosphorus, a faint light spilled through the lattice window, falling across the red silk sheets. In the corner of the bed lay the handkerchief, stained. Whether by ritual, by fear, or by something darker, no one ever asked. The witness gathered it silently, folded it, and placed it inside a small golden box. That box would be delivered to the palace record-keeper. It would be stored, sealed, and never opened again. Proof of purity, proof of obedience, proof that the machine of the empire still turned. The princess was bathed again at sunrise. Her attendants washed her skin with lavender water, combed her hair, and dressed her in a new robe of white silk. She was not allowed to speak of the night. Not a word. Not ever. When the matron entered, she placed a pearl necklace around the girl's neck, a symbol of virtue, and whispered the same phrase spoken to every bride before her. "You are reborn." But the princess knew better. Something inside her had died. The morning ceremony was brief. The sultan himself did not attend. His presence was reserved for triumphs, not aftermaths. Instead, the vizier, the imams, and the royal scribes gathered in the courtyard. The golden box was presented, unopened. A prayer was recited. The vizier nodded once, and the marriage was declared complete. There were no cheers, no applause. Only the sound of the muezzin's call rising from the city below, a sound that felt both holy and hollow. The eunuchs bowed. The attendants dispersed. And life inside the palace continued, as if nothing had happened. But for the princess, nothing was the same. The laughter of the younger girls in the harem felt distant now. The sunlight in the courtyards seemed too bright. Every sound, every step, echoed like an accusation. She smiled when expected. She spoke when required. She played the role flawlessly. But at night, when the palace grew quiet, she would sit by her window and stare at the moon, wondering if any of the women before her had ever found peace. Some tried to resist. A few spoke out. But history remembers them only as mad or possessed. Their names were erased, their portraits removed, their stories buried beneath the marble floors of the harem. There is a letter, unsigned, believed to have been written by one of them, a princess whose name was forbidden to be spoken. It reads, "They call this honor. They say I am blessed. But my blessings bleed, and my silence screams louder than any prayer." The letter ends there. No historian knows how it was found, or how it survived. But perhaps it was never meant for us. Perhaps it was a message to the next girl, a warning whispered across centuries. The empire lasted for hundreds of years. Sultans rose and fell. Palaces changed. But the ritual endured. Each generation claimed it was softened, civilized, modernized. Yet at its core, it remained the same, a ceremony of power, disguised as sanctity. And through it all, the women endured in silence. Because silence was safer than truth. Because the empire could not bear the sound of its own cruelty. As centuries passed, the ritual was spoken of less and less. When foreign visitors asked about it, Ottoman scholars smiled politely and called it a rumor. Even when European painters and travelers described the bridal traditions in their journals, they were dismissed as fantasists, men seduced by the exotic. The empire rewrote its memory, purged its guilt, and the truth was hidden, not by fire, but by time. Yet even today, the palace whispers. On certain nights, when the Bosphorus wind carries the scent of salt and jasmine, the guards say they hear soft footsteps in the empty corridors, a rustle of silk, a quiet sob. They say the princesses still walk there, searching for the freedom they were denied. They are not ghosts of vengeance, but of remembrance. Because no empire, no matter how golden, can silence what it has forgotten to bury. They told her silence was safety, that obedience was a shield, the only way to survive the palace. But in truth, silence was its own kind of death. The empire didn't need to kill its women to erase them. All it needed was time and fear. After the wedding night, a princess was no longer a child. She was now a wife of the empire. But that title came with invisible chains. Her every word was monitored. Her every gesture could be reported to the chief eunuch, who answered directly to the sultan. The man she had married, once a commander or governor, was now more prisoner than partner. He was forbidden from speaking about his wife to anyone outside the palace. Forbidden from showing affection in public. Forbidden, even, from visiting her chamber without permission. Love had no place in politics. And the palace was nothing if not political. Some princesses accepted this quietly. They lived like ghosts in golden cages, their beauty fading into ritual, their voices reduced to prayers whispered in empty rooms. But not all of them could. Some refused to remain silent. Some tried to run. And for them, the price of disobedience was absolute. There is an account, hidden in a Venetian diplomat's private journal, of a young Ottoman princess who tried to escape the palace in the early 1600s. Her name has been lost, but her story survived in fragments. They say she bribed a servant to deliver a letter to a man she loved, a poet imprisoned for mocking the Sultan's court. When the letter was discovered, the servant was executed immediately. The princess was not killed. Death, they believed, would be too merciful. Instead, she was stripped of her title, her name removed from the royal record, and she was sent away to a remote estate on the outskirts of Edirne. There, she lived out her days alone, her only companions the sound of birds and the memory of laughter. Locals who later tended the estate said that sometimes, on quiet nights, a woman's voice could be heard singing softly in Persian. No one dared approach. They said it was her way of speaking after death, the song of a woman history had ordered to be silent. Other princesses met crueler ends. Those accused of adultery, even without proof, were condemned under what the empire called the law of shadows. They would simply disappear. No trial, no burial, only the rustle of silk in the night, and the whisper of the Bosphorus swallowing another secret. The palace never spoke of it. The courtiers looked away. And the world outside continued to believe in the myth of royal grace. For those who remained, life became a slow unraveling of hope. They were given titles: Lady of the Garden, Keeper of the Fountain, Guardian of the Harem Birds. Empty honors for women who could never leave. They spent their days tending roses, composing poems that no one would read, embroidering tapestries that would hang in rooms they would never see again. To the empire, they were symbols of purity. To themselves, they were ghosts in daylight. The punishment was not always physical. Sometimes it was psychological, a gradual suffocation of the spirit. The palace knew how to destroy a woman without spilling blood. They would separate her from her servants, replace her confidants, change the locks on her chamber doors. Her letters would be intercepted, her possessions quietly removed, her favorite songs banned from the musicians' repertoire. The goal was simple: make her disappear while she still lived. In time, even memory surrendered. The princesses began to believe the stories told about them. They convinced themselves that silence was nobility, that obedience was virtue, that fear was faith. It was a kind of survival, but one that left no trace. And that was precisely what the empire wanted. A few dared to write their pain in secret journals. Some of these pages were found centuries later, hidden inside the wooden beams of the palace. Their handwriting was delicate, their words careful, but their sorrow unmistakable. One passage, translated from Ottoman Turkish, reads, "We're taught to bow before God and the Sultan alike. But I wonder, if both are silent when we cry, which one is truly divine?" Another simply says, "I wake each morning and thank the walls for keeping my secrets. They are kinder than men." By the 18th century, the empire began to change. Western visitors brought new ideas, new technologies, new questions. But the palace remained untouched, its traditions wrapped in gold and denial. The Sultan's daughters were still married off to secure alliances, still offered as symbols of power. The words, consent, and freedom, did not exist in their world. And yet, cracks began to appear. Whispers turned into doubts. One by one, the old rules began to lose their grip. But not before taking their final victims. The last known record of the ritual comes from the late 1800s, in the reign of Sultan Abdulhamid II. A European governess employed in the palace wrote in her memoir, "By the dawn of the 20th century, the empire that had once ruled continents was slowly dying. Its palaces stood like hollow shells, echoes of a glory that had consumed itself. The Sultan's power was fading, the harem was emptying, and the language of obedience was losing its meaning. But within those decaying walls, one last generation of royal daughters still lived, and with them, the final whisper of the old ritual. The last Ottoman princesses were born into a world of contradictions. They were educated in French, wore Parisian perfumes, read English novels, yet were still bound by laws written centuries before their births. They walked between two worlds, one of gold, one of ash. The empire wanted them to be symbols of tradition. The new century demanded that they be women. And between those demands, they slowly disappeared. One of them, her name rarely spoken, was said to have refused her arranged marriage entirely. The records call her the defiant daughter. She was the last to see the ritual chamber before it was sealed forever. When the attendants came to prepare her for the ceremony, she locked her door from the inside. For 3 days, she neither ate nor spoke. On the 4th, she appeared before the court, dressed not in silk, but in mourning black. "I will not be touched," she said. Her voice, though trembling, carried through the hall like thunder. The viziers called it madness. The Sultan called it blasphemy. But no one dared to harm her. For even the empire understood, it was dying. And when the empire finally fell in 1922, the royal family was exiled. The princes fled first, carrying what gold they could. The women followed, their jewels sewn into the hems of their dresses. They traveled by train through the cold of Europe, their titles stripped, their futures uncertain. In Paris, some found work as seamstresses. Others lived quietly under false names. And in time, even the memory of who they were began to fade. But not all traces vanished. In an antique shop in Florence, a historian once found a small golden box, its lid engraved with Ottoman script. Inside lay a folded silk handkerchief, aged, fragile, stained faintly with time. There was no note, no record of who had placed it there. Only a single symbol etched on the inner lid, a crescent, and beneath it, A single word in Arabic. Enough. Perhaps that was her message. Perhaps it was the final act of rebellion, to take the proof the empire demanded, and turn it into her own declaration of freedom. No one can say for certain. But after that discovery, the scholar who owned the box wrote in his diary, the empire's greatest secret was not its cruelty, but the quiet endurance of its women. History remembers the conquerors. It forgets the survivors. Today, visitors walk the polished floors of the Topkapi Palace. They marvel at the mosaics, the golden doors, the fountains that once flowed with rosewater. But few notice the smaller things, the tiny handprints pressed into the marble, the scratches along the inside of old wooden chests, the initials carved faintly into stone by unseen hands. Each mark a message, each silence a voice. If you listen closely, the palace still breathes. At dusk, when the crowds leave and the lights dim, the corridors return to their natural quiet. The air grows colder. The sea breeze carries the faint echo of a woman humming, a song without words, a melody without end. Perhaps it is the last princess, the one who said no, the one who refused to be part of the ritual. Or perhaps it is all of them, their memories stitched together like silk, a tapestry of sorrow, defiance, and grace. Empires die, palaces crumble, names are forgotten, but the stories of those who suffered in silence never truly vanish. They remain in the corners of rooms, in the dust of forgotten manuscripts, in the hearts of those who still dare to ask, what really happened behind those golden doors? Because history is not written only by kings. Sometimes it is written by the women who dared to survive them. And so, the ritual ended, not by decree, not by revolution, but by exhaustion. The weight of centuries of obedience collapsed under the quiet strength of a generation, who finally said, enough. The empire's curse died not with blood, but with a whisper. And in that whisper, freedom was born.